Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's 3 minutes past, so let's make a start. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Paul Brown. I hope most of you probably do by now. Welcome to this PEBA webinar. As I'm sure most of you will remember from past years, every year we try and get the Planning Inspectorate to come along and talk to us about their work, what they're doing, what the burdens on them are, how they're performing in terms of caseload. The last year has been a particularly challenging year for everybody, I think, working in the planning area, particularly with the initial period of the pandemic when all manner of events were cancelled. We've all been through the process of learning to get to grips with virtual events, some of us more successfully than others. And now as we're starting to see the glimmerings of hope and possibly coming out the other side of the pandemic, the conversation is beginning as to the extent to which the lessons that we've learned over the last year might inform the way in which future events will be run. And certainly right from the very beginning of the discussions that we had with PINS at the start of the pandemic, when people were looking at hosting virtual events, it was made very clear to us that virtual events were not seen by PINS simply as a short-term response to the pandemic. It was something that had been in people's minds for a long time as a way of running potentially all manner of planning inquiries and hearings. And something that was said to me in no uncertain terms in conversations I had with PINS at the time were that nobody should assume that at the end of the pandemic that the world would simply go back to the way that it was before. That's a conversation which is still to be had, and personally I think it would be very interesting to hear how the actual experience of dealing with virtual events has influenced PINS' feeling on that. This evening to talk to us about all those things, how PINS is coping just in overall terms, any clues, tips, experiences that there may be about virtual hearings and examinations, how best you can work with them, and also some ideas about what might be happening in the future. We've got a splendid array of, of inspectors to deal with, to speak to us this evening. First up, we're going to start with Rebecca Phillips. Rebecca's been an inspector for 12 years, with the inspector for 15 years. She's currently the professional lead for planning appeals. She's going to be followed by Jerry Yule, who's been with the inspectorate also for 15 years. He says in brackets, too long, surely. And he's now the professional lead for local plans, and in that regard he looks after the quality of local plan work, not so much at the coalface, but sort of supervising things from behind the scenes. And then finally, in terms of the arranged speakers this evening, many of you will know Peter Rose. He's a practicing Section 78 inspector, working in the field, direct experience of virtual inquiries, and also has a key role in developing and delivering inquiry training to inspectors, and many PEBA members have actually been involved in that. We also have with us this evening Stuart Reed and Ahsan Ghafoor, who they share the professional lead role for enforcement. They're not programmed to speak this evening because we think that by the time we've heard from Rebecca, Jerry, and Peter, that will probably, if we're lucky, allow some time for questions. And Peter promises, rather Stuart promises, that he's going to come back and deliver what he calls a blockbuster enforcement session on another occasion. But he and Ahsan are both here and may wish to contribute to some of the question and answers when we get there. In terms of how Q&A will work, you are all muted and your microphones are switched off. But if you wish to raise questions, and please, I would welcome questions, start queuing them up as early as you would like for when we get to that point in the evening. Use the Q&A function, not the chat function, and I will do my best to try and sift and sort those as they're coming through and then direct them. I think probably in terms of presentation, the most sensible way of dealing with it is to ask Rebecca, Jerry, and Peter to speak one after another, and then we'll come to the Q&A afterwards. But don't necessarily wait until then. If you've got a question that occurs to you along the way, please pop it on the Q&A board, and that means I can start working out what I need to ask then. With that said, Rebecca, I think, has some slides. I'm not sure that either Peter or Jerry does, but I'm going to start with her. Rebecca, thank you very much for being here this evening, and over to you.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, to you all for having us here this evening. So, yeah, I'm Rebecca Phillips, as Paul introduced me, planning lead, professional lead on planning appeals. And this evening, I thought it might be useful if I took you through our thinking about the future. So, what I'm leading on is a forward-looking piece of work to decide how best we take forward casework in the future, based on our experience of conducting virtual events to date, and how we might use sort of virtual events in the future as part of our operating model. And I thought you might be interested to learn what we're doing as part of that project. As you know, we've been conducting casework for coming up to a year. I think it was May 2020 when we had our first virtual hearing. And since that time, we've run a number, albeit 800, series of different types of events across all different types of casework over that last 12 months. So I think it's a good time for us to actually look at how we are conducting casework and to take stock and to think about what we're going to do for the future. Now, you may know that at the time we did have a lot of help from PEBA, and we were very, very grateful to them for actually helping us to develop virtual events. So when we first started, of course, with that one event in May, that first hearing, we had a lot of support from the membership in helping us to develop what we call protocols about how we actually, we went about, going around the actual event of setting up the protocols. So I'm going to try and share my screen now. I can't get into the slideshow a moment, but I'll
Is it resume slideshow, Rebecca? If you go to the, can you see on the, yes, just up, if you go resume, yes. We can see your slides.
And I wanted to do it in slideshow, and I'm not sure how this is.
If you just, yes, go left from there. Is there a thing that says resume slideshow?
Got it, thank you.
Right,
there we are. Great, lovely. Okay, so I'll start. So essentially, it's worth pointing out the Frank's principles. I mean, I'm going to look at the principles upon which we've adhered to all this time and try to do so, and it's really key in all of what we do, openness, fairness and impartiality, and we don't want to stray far from that. Yes, we'll be engaging with our customers, stakeholders and others through doing this, and I'll lead us through a little bit of a program of what we're doing, but of course it's worth pointing out that everything we do has to adhere to those Frank's principles. Other principles that we wish to adhere to is clearly the planning system white paper, and some of the key themes that we've looked at on this to ensure that what we're doing will chime with government objectives of how we take casework forward. So, of course, there's a big emphasis in the white paper on harnessing digital technology, making it easier to access information on planning proposals and to visualise them as well. Increasing engagement is a real key piece for us at the local plan phase, and that's, Jerry's going to talk about local plans, but that's a real theme of the white paper. Improved user experience as well, is focusing on the customer and stakeholders, but making it easier to find information in real time and the relevant information as well. As we know, we get a plethora of information submitted to us on all of our casework, but it's making that easier, making it more simple for everyone to understand, what information is important and pertinent to the case in hand. Make it easier to provide views about emerging proposals as well, and I mentioned about visualising as well, and on the go, making it accessible and user friendly so that you can use a smartphone, and that's specifically mentioned in the white paper proposals as well. Making it a modern operation and ensuring that digital planning services can be accessed from home or, as I say, on the go. Real-time information, high quality visual, data not documentation, and all these things are emphasised in the white paper, which we thought was pertinent to how we look about our operating model in future. And of course, we've got project speed as well as plan reform, which is all about faster delivery of the key infrastructure projects as well. So based on that, taking those sort of key principles in the white paper and looking at what we wish to do, our key principles have to be around improved and increased inclusivity, accessibility and engagement. That all chimes with what we're doing in relation to virtual events now and learning from that. But I think there are huge opportunities we can take to further that out. Base it on the improved user experience, to better meet customers. It's very, very difficult for all now with caring and work responsibilities to take time off work to turn up in person to a hearing, to an inquiry, to a local plan examination. It's far easier, for them to access that digitally, and it could free up a lot of their time as well. They could, have an opportunity to come in for an hour or two at a time rather than, whole days and waiting to hear when the inspector can hear from them, for example. Digital by default, we talk about this, but I think the thing to emphasize in it's the ability to participate, engage more flexibly, but not excluding, of course, those who cannot take part virtually. We have to offer an opportunity for those to engage too. And it does chime with all the high-level principles in the white paper about the better use of digital technology for all of us, really, to understand and, as I mentioned, visualise planning proposals. And there's a lot coming through from the market too on Plan Tech, aimed to help with that. And I think we have to equip our inspectors to deal with it. If that's going to be part of the agreed evidence base, then we have to equip our inspectors to deal with it too. Albeit I think there has to a long way to go in terms of agreed standards to make sure that the information is reliable and it is agreed by all the parties as well. So it mentioned data, not documents. And sustainability, I think the real key about this is to be resilient and flexible. None of us know what's around the corner. We have learned in this last 12 months that this has been a real important way that we've managed to keep casework moving. And in the face of, local lockdowns, then further national lockdowns, we can't rely on being able to go back into a physical, venue all the time. So I think this is all about making sure we're flexible and we have the ability to react to circumstances as well. I think that's a real key. And organisational resilience as well, in doing that, making ourselves able to conduct casework and continue to do that. So what we're looking to do, that's the purpose of the project, looking for an operating model. It might be different across, different case areas. We're looking at the pros and cons of that. Testing that principle of digital by default as well. Are they more convenient to the user? We're not going to assume that they are, because they may be convenient to some, but not others. Are they more efficient and effective to run? And I've said before, they are proving very resource intensive because we're not geared up to operate digitally. We did this very much in the context of a response to an emergency pandemic. All our systems are not geared up to this full time. We need to look at that because they are proving very resource intensive. For example, requiring digital support and also some support for the inspector during the event, whereas normally an inspector would conduct an event away from home at the venue of the council. They may have some admin support depending on the nature of the event from the council's offices themselves, but they wouldn't have a case officer there in the room with them for the whole of the event, which is the case for most of the events that we run now. And I think we also have to, make sure that we keep up to speed with what's happening in the white paper, all the planning proposals, project speed, the planning reform, and make sure that what we do can be flexible to meet with those, objectives, and to, make the most of that as well. We need to also align with our own strategic plan, and all those other things. The Rosewell review recommendations as well. It has ticked a lot of those boxes, but there are a few there that are still to deliver. And this is actually helping us to move towards some of those review recommendations as well. And building on that feedback and learning from what we've done under what we're calling now the interim operating model, with essentially what we've been, how we've been rolling casework out for the last 12 months, and learning from that, all the lessons learned. And Peter, I think, will be able to say a little bit more about that from the coal face, as it were. And of course, we have to make sure that colleagues, inspectors, case officers, trade unions, etc., are all on board with us as our external stakeholders. And we will be reaching out to you. I know we had an initial, Bridget Rosewell hosted webinar some time ago, which you kindly, supported us through John's presence at that. I think it needs to be a continuing dialogue, and there'll be more stakeholder events as we do determine the way forward. Okay, so I think, I'll share with you some of the event feedback that we had, but we are doing some more customer research because, of course, when we ask these questions to anybody who'd taken part in a virtual event, participants and our inspectors and case officers, we did ask them in the context of a pandemic. And I think we need to revisit some of those questions to ask, you know, if, for example, we've asked people, would they be willing to participate in a virtual event again? That was done in the context of there not being another option. So I think we have to revisit and look at those questions again and you know, look closely at the answers and set them in a slightly different context this time. So the data then is being conducted from a survey that was done mid-January, you know, up until then. So it's nearly a year's worth of data there, and we basically, you know, use that to focus it into themes and suggestions for feedback, etc. This is a high-level summary of the analysis. You know, the strong majority there rated their experience as excellent and good, the length of time, etc. And they would be happy to do another virtual event. But again, that was set in the context of a pandemic. That might slightly change if we asked whether they'd be willing to do that as part of our future operating model. Some of the improvements then, I mean, there's no great surprises here, I don't think, from the audience here or for us. But I think it would be so useful to better share information. I think we have a real opportunity here that we can explore. And again, as I said, it would chime with the planning reform agenda as well. Screen sharing can be difficult. You know, there's practicalities in that. If you share your screen, you know, you can't see the audience. So there are some difficulties with it, and Peter might be able to better explain from the cold face, as it were, the pros and cons of that. But I think that the one key thing about that, certainly for me, is about accessible documentation. And you know, we had some very good input to this and suggestions from PEBA in the early days around protocols. And I think that's really important. It's difficult because local planning authorities are all at different stages in terms of being able to resource it, appellants too. But I think we do need to sort of feedback and show how we need accessible documentation that's well paginated, easily to navigate and tabulated and all those things. In terms of a preference, you know, the strong majority did feel that there was a part for virtual events to play, but a third did you know, show that they wanted to revert to physical events. But I think for the most as well, a combined approach would be the ideal too. So virtual for some situations, physical for others. So we're going to have to consider all of these thoughts that were fed back to us. Yes, virtual saves time. To some, not to all. I mean, we're finding it very resource intensive, as I said. Saves money, possibly with the TNS, but I'm not sure around the support to do that. And bearing in mind, we are taking on a lot more of roles and responsibilities that otherwise would have been the local planning authorities to date, just to keep casework moving. You know, we need to think and balance that in any future operating model going forward. There's a lot to be said about the interaction. Peter will no doubt touch on this, and being able to read the room too. We've had a mixed feedback on that. The majority feel that, you know, physical events are better to do that, but some feel that they can do that equally well through virtual means. And you know, it'd be interesting to dive further into that question to find out why that is, and you know, why that should make a difference to some and not others. And some improvements. You know, obviously we all know that we have a home life and young children in the mix for some and others, and you know, sitting for an inquiry for weeks on end is a little bit different from a day's hearing, perhaps, in terms of the impact on the wider household. You know, and other things that might happen, such as broadband being intermittent, or roadwork starting outside, or you know, internal improvements as well. I think most of us have had some sort of work done on the house since this lockdown too, and taken the opportunity to do that. So I think, you know, we do have to really think about how this is impacting on inspectors' work life, and also others as well. You know, some might, you know, not be able to take part virtually because of these issues they may be facing at home too. And I think ideally what we'd like to do is potentially look at a decision with criteria. I mean, that's one option. We haven't ruled anything out or anything in at the moment, but I think important for us to develop is some criteria that will, sort of influence decision making, whether that's done with appellants, whether that's done with the local planning authorities. I think they have to have an opportunity to input to this. We've used it well to determine blended events, and that's a fairly new thing for us. We've only been able to run a handful, 2 local plan examinations, and we've got really good evidence for how they worked, hosted by the local planning authority, and one other. We were going to run some more blended events that were stopped because of the, first of all, local and then national lockdowns. But when I talk about blended, I mean a part virtual, a part in the room as physical. But in the end, the majority of those blended events that were set to run had to be stopped because of the council's inability to put them on at the end of it, in a safe environment. If the facilities manager did get involved, then it was deemed to be too risky in order to make sure there were all the things in place that needed to be, all the deep cleaning, all the separation, etc. And they failed because of that. So it'd be nice if we could run some more blended events over the summer, and then we'd have some really good evidence upon which to base how a future operating might work. And of course, each decision will have to consider relative resources, costs, the customer, accessibility. We're looking at all these high-level criteria at the moment to drill down as to what are going to be the really important factors. And, I think it's going to vary depending on the type of case and case-to-case circumstances as well. And we've worked well on the blended criteria and live streaming criteria as well, where we've worked very closely with the local planning authority to help inform those decisions around things like live streaming and whether we do a blended event too. And of course, what we're trying to do is a cost benefit analysis. Trying to extrapolate costs of a physical versus virtual is actually very difficult, but we will try and do it across relative costs if we can't find the actual cost to do that upon and base our assumptions on. Okay, so that's my slideshow. I have rushed through because, of course, we've had a number of us to talk, but I am happy to take questions and a bit of debate at the end. That might be helpful.
Rebecca, thank you very much for that. Before I pass over to Jerry, can I just ask, sort of stealing first question, looking ahead, I mean, you're talking about work that's ongoing at the moment, and obviously we've got to get beyond the pandemic before we can start putting in place a permanent scheme. But do you have a sort of timeline in mind for any kind of consultation process or decisions, or, I mean, over what sort of timescale are we looking at PINs firming up on some of the things that you've taken us through?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Good question. In terms of the future operating model, we will be sort of doing all this analysis through the summer and stakeholder workshops right through the summer. We've made a commitment to the unions to consult with them in the early autumn. So I think we will keep to that, and then we'll start to hopefully pilot more things, early autumn onwards. But it's a future operating model that is looking to come into place in January 22. That's our end goal.
Thank you. All right, Rebecca, thank you very much. Jerry, I'm going to pass over to you next.
Hi, thank you. Well, thank you all for inviting me. I'm going to talk about local plans. I will talk a bit about virtual events, but I'm going to cover a few other things first. So firstly, the fall in plan submission numbers. Oh dear, they're going down. The question of are more plans failing at examination, which I think is what we would believe from the planning press, because bad news is a good news story. Something I do see as a real problem, the never-ending local plan examination. I'll touch a little bit on planning reform, and then I'll come back to virtual. So you may be pleased or not pleased to know I'm not going to do any slides. But first of all, there's a bit of a milestone. So you remember back in 2004, we had a government that introduced a new, faster, better, more certain, more streamlined planning system. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? Well, okay, so we're several years on from that. We are examining now our plan number 1000 under that regime. So that's quite a milestone. It's the PEBA and Mid Suffolk Joint Local Plan has the honour, if that's the right word, of being plan number 1000. So that's quite interesting. I did try and persuade someone or some people in the inspectorate to work out how many appeals we might have done as an organisation in our 100 years or so. No one has the faintest idea. I'd like to think it was 1 million, because then we'd be able to say we've done 100 national infrastructure projects, 1,000 plans and 1 million appeals, but no one knows for sure, so it's just a kind of myth. So I said I'd talk about planning submission numbers, so how things going under the dying embers of the old current planning system. Well, until 2 years ago, the average for several years had been that we would get 5 or 6 plans submitted to us each month for examination. It was pretty steady state no matter what happened, and it was like that for several years. But in 2019 to 20, that fell to an average about 3 a month, and last financial year, or this financial year that ends in 2021, it's fallen to 2 a month on average. So that's quite, I think, quite a significant fall in numbers, and that's quite interesting when government's target is still for all councils to have an up-to-date plan by 2023. So of course, been wondering, as probably many people have, why this very noticeable downturn. Well, we think there was uncertainty for quite a long time over housing need calculations and exactly how you worked out as a local authority how many houses you were supposed to plan for. Well, that of course is now resolved. Then we had COVID, the pandemic and the lockdown, and that obviously caused local authorities to slow down consultation that they might have been planning, and they probably had a reduction in staff resource. Certainly the planning inspectorate was probably most significantly hit in resourcing terms by the number of inspectors we had and other staff homeschooling, which is kind of a bit of a hidden effect, I think. And then just as we kind of got to grips with doing virtual, we have, of course, planning reform coming over the horizon, and probably legitimate for local authorities to say, well, why should we prepare one of these old-fashioned plans when the glossy new white paper local plans are coming very soon and we'll be required to do them? Should we not throw our resources into that? So kind of 3 reasons, I think, for the slowdown there, and possibly also an underlying problem of local authority resourcing. We do hear anecdotally about quite small numbers in some local authority planning teams. So that's not great news, is it? Projections show a slight upturn in spring based on what local authorities are telling us. So there may be signs of life there, but we'll see. And I think probably what we're all waiting for is for government to tell us what's happening with planning reform and see what incentives there might be to local authorities and to get on and do a plan under the current system before the new system comes in. So there we go, planning submission numbers down. Planning press, I think, is also some of the stories recently have been saying, well, there is a problem, isn't it, with more local plans failing at examination, especially on the duty to cooperate. So it is true, there have been 5 duty to cooperate failures over the last year or so. You can probably all name them. But I suppose what I would say is that in the end, most plans are still found sound. So if you're looking since 2016, I think there have been 6 duty to cooperate failures. 13 plans have not made it to adoption in the end, which means that 94% of plans, around 200, have actually reached the final goal, the finishing line. And of those unlucky 13 that didn't make it through, I think at least 2 or 3 of those were withdrawn by the council as it changed political persuasion, which shows you how controversial these things are, but it wasn't because those plans couldn't have been found sound in the end. So inspectors still doing the job really of trying to get plans in place, trying to get plans in a position where they can be found sound, because that's their job and that's what the Act tells them to do. There has, of course, been a lot of talk about the duty to cooperate recently, and the Sevenoaks legal challenge was quite high profile, but as you'll know, that challenge was considered in the High Court with a fairly robust decision, and permission was then refused to take. Sevenoaks didn't get permission to take the case to the Court of Appeal. The court order from the Court of Appeal is worth looking at if you've not seen it. I think it's got some quite striking wording. So what do I take from that? Well, in a way, I don't think it's actually that difficult to pass the duty to cooperate. It's not a duty to agree, it's a duty to cooperate. And that's all it's about, really. It's about having a meaningful attempt to solve whatever the strategic issue is, which is usually going to be unmet housing need, by engaging with your neighbours about it. Where it goes wrong is if councils don't actually go down the line of having a decent go at engagement. So I don't think there's a huge trend necessarily of failing plans or anything about the duty to cooperate that should really be a disincentive to a local authority submitting a plan. And as we know, as I said, inspectors are required by the Act to recommend main modifications to make plans sound if asked to do so by the council. So that's what they do. And even if that takes forever, because there's no time limit in the Act, which does bring us to something that I do think is a problem at the moment, which is the never-ending or perpetual examination. So at the moment we have 65 live examinations on the go, and of those, 17 are transitional local plans. So those are plans submitted to us before January 2019, before the 24th of January. So they're still being considered against the 2012 framework. One of these plans, rather shamefully, is now heading for its 4th birthday with us, which is not a good thing. And if that wasn't bad enough, after January 2019, of course, housing need in local plans submitted after that point was based on local housing need. You'll probably know from PPG that the housing need calculation is good for 2 years into the examination. So guess what? We now have 4 plans that have reached the 2-year mark where local housing needs recalculating. So that is not a good sign. That means 23 out of 65 plans, nearly a third, have been with us for over 2 years. I should stress, though, that of the plans that have been submitted over the last 4 years, many of them actually do make it through the system in 1 to 2 years. Good plan can get through in a year or so with a fair wind, but there is a kind of rump of hard to move on plans. So why would that be? Well, I suppose some of them are just big and complex plans which are politically and locally controversial, so we might expect them to take a long time in examination, though 4 years is going it. There are places like York, Central Bedfordshire, North Essex, some collection of new towns there. They're bound to be tricky. Some of the plans that are with us were submitted without key evidence having been done, so it took time to get that done. And the main cause of delay is really the main modifications process, because if the inspector's charged with fixing soundness, and that needs new evidence, new work, finding more sites, more consultation, council getting political agreement for that, more hearings, that can take a very long time, and especially if the process goes around more than once. And then, of course, during this long period, things happen. Government changes the used classes order. We have pre-election periods, new household projections come out, all sorts of things happen that tend to slow things down. And on top of that, of course, we've had COVID as well, creating an extra delay. So I think that is a real problem with the current planning system. It is very hard to get some plans to the finish line. We have the perpetual examination, which takes us to planning reform, which will surely solve all those problems. So in a way, I can't really say too much about planning reform because it's obviously a government project, not a planning inspectorate project. So really, I don't know any more than what's in the white paper. But you may be pleased to know we've seconded some inspectors into MHCLG to help work on this. I mean, it is an absolutely huge project, but I have to stress they're working for MHCLG on this. They're not working for the planning inspectorate, but they do bring, you know, a sharp end experience of being planning inspectors, but also working in local authorities and working in the private sector as well. So they're people who know what's going on and what works. So I think that has been helpful. And of course, everyone has a view on planning reform. Mine is that it is possible to achieve the 9-month examination that the white paper talks about. It actually talks about 9 months or faster. But I think there have to be some preconditions for that to be achieved. Something has to change. So this is personal view, really. I don't know if this is going to happen or not. I don't think there can be scope for significant changes to a plan in an examination that's so short. I think there probably needs to be some sort of meaningful gateway test before a plan gets into examination, i.e., for instance, not accepting plans where the evidence has not been completed. it's going to help if cross-border issues relating to housing needs have been resolved before submission. I'm not entirely confident that one will be an easy one to crack. And the other thing is, I think there has to be a role for local authorities to actually consider all the representations that have been made on the plan, because I'm slightly concerned about the idea that you might just leave thousands of comments to an inspector or inspectors, because I think a key stage of any consultation process is for those who sought the comments in the first place to have the chance to consider them in a meaningful way. But what I don't know is whether any or all of those things will happen, or exactly how they will turn out. So, okay, that takes us finally to virtual, which is what you actually asked me to talk about, I think. So, history lesson, the first virtual local plan hearing session was, I think everyone thinks it's South Oxfordshire in July last year, but in fact it was Rossendale which actually got in first with a phone conference in June 2020. So Rossendale was actually the first, but of course South Oxfordshire was the first big one. It was the first multi-day event carried out entirely by video. So where are we now? As we stand now, we have taken 42 local plans through virtual hearings. Some have been done by Zoom, some have been done by Teams because they're hosted by the local authority. So we work with the local authority to use whichever platform they run and are comfortable with. Nearly all of those have been multi-day events. I have to say, it's not only the planning inspectorate that's made this work, it's been the local authorities, programme officers and participants. So everyone has actually been pretty helpful on this. We wouldn't have done it without everyone. And Rebecca talked about blended events. There were actually 2 blended events that ran in Hambleton and Doncaster. I think they got a little bit curtailed in their blendedness as we moved into lockdown. But all the signs were they were working quite well. So blended there, some people in the room together, some people beaming in by video. But of course, is the most complex of all. And I think both those authorities hired in media companies to help them run it. So then by Christmas, we'd effectively remove the backlog of hearings that have been cancelled. And so every plan examination that should have had hearings by Christmas had done so. So almost back to level. We do have some facts about South Oxfordshire. So that was 4 weeks of hearings. 469 people appeared virtually. 15,000 people took a view on YouTube for a total combined viewing hours of 7,000 hours. And one session had 850 people who tuned in to watch it. So that's quite interesting. It's obviously far more people than would turn up at a real event in Town Hall. 850 would be a scary number to be appearing in front of. Because viewing isn't quite the same as participation, but it does open up the process to more people to see what's happening. So what does all this tell us? Well, in a pandemic, virtual allowed us to keep the show on the road. Participants, I think, have pretty much generally accepted this. There haven't been any substantive challenges that what we've been doing is unfair in local plans. We think a virtual hearing can be a fair one, and it can be run in a way that gives inspectors everything they need to make their decision. But is something missing? Well, some people think so, something almost intangible. So it's a tricky one. We have been collecting feedback off people, surveying people who've taken part in virtual events. And I think, as Rebecca said, the majority of people recognise the need for virtual in the pandemic. But I don't think there's a great deal of consensus about what people's preference is once the pandemic is over. So from what local authorities have told us, some would like to stay entirely virtual. Some would like a mix of some physical and some virtual sessions. Some want blended, where some people are there virtually and others are there for real. And don't think anyone wanted to go back to solely physical, which is interesting. And you know, Paul was talking at the start there about is this all a bit of a game changer? Participants, pretty much equally split between seeing virtual, physical and blended as a preference. So that's difficult. And I think it's fair to say that inspectors are also quite split on it. Some clearly do prefer virtual because of the convenience, and some have said tends to lead to a calmer event if the issue is quite heated. But I think probably a majority of inspectors would prefer to go back to real. So where do we go in future? Well, you've heard from Rebecca, we have a project running to decide what we do once we come out of the pandemic, and all options are open to us, though for the moment everything is virtual. We know the options: real, virtual, blended, or some kind of mix of the above for multi-day hearings. I think the big issue for us is firstly, how do we decide who decides? And then secondly, what criteria would you develop to decide how a particular hearing would be run? And if you think about the options for who decides, well, none of them are entirely straightforward, are they? It might be more straightforward if government, for instance, said, well, everything will now be virtual because we would all do what we were told. You could say, the inspectors examining this plan, it will be for the inspector to decide. But then you would probably have events that were carried out in a way that was really influenced primarily by the personal preference of the inspector, which doesn't entirely feel right. You could say maybe the local authority should decide. It's their plan that's being examined, and they have to pay the costs of the examination, so maybe they should get what they want. But then you know, you would end up with one authority next to another with the examination run quite differently. Or you could somehow try and do something more sophisticated, which involves deciding based on criteria, looking carefully at what's going to work for each case, though I still find it quite difficult to think through exactly what the criteria might be. So this one's going to be interesting. I don't really know where it's going. As has been said, the planning inspector has got quite a lot of work to do on that. So there you go. That's everything I wanted to cover, and I'll hand back to you, Paul.
Thank you very much indeed, Jerry. Before I hand over to Peter, I've got a question which I am going to fire at you, Jerry, because it arose in the course, and I think it at the point where you were talking about the difficulties of the never-ending plan, and the question was, you know, what's the solution? Is it no transitioning? Is it a cut-off date? Is it a basic list of evidence that's got to be provided? Or, I mean, you know, do you see any ways around bringing it in?
Yeah, it is a horrendous problem, because the longer these examinations go on, you know, as they hit the second or third or fourth year, the more unpalatable it seems to bring them to an end. I suppose, yes, as the new planning system comes in and you have plans going through the old system, you could have government saying, you know, let's introduce some sort of sunset clause on this. You know, if a plan's not adopted by a certain date, then it is timed out. That could be one way to do it. I suppose government could say to inspectors, stop being so pragmatic, because that was an instruction to the planning inspectorate, but it's also written into the PPG. It's also written into the Act, isn't it? You know, recommend minor modifications if asked to do so, but you could see a change there. And yeah, I'm not. The new system offers the hope, actually, really. You know, if you're going to have a fixed timescale, then really things have got to be different. We probably have to accept that some more plans wouldn't make it through. You might need gateway tests. You might need a list of required evidence. You know, you might need something that's more directive, say, you know, your plan must come in with this evidence. This is all the evidence you need, but you must do it. If you don't, you're not going to start examination. So there are lots of options there. It's going to be fascinating to see what government comes up with.
Thank you. And while I'm still on, I'm going to read out, there was a question at the end of this, which was how might you determine whether the case is one that should be primarily in person, even if partially blended, and who should determine? And I think that was probably typed out at precisely the point where you were commenting on the difficulty of making that. But I'm going to read the comment that went before it. A number of the judges in the senior civil courts are concerned that virtual hearings don't allow cases to be presented as effectively or that it's more difficult to gauge body language, especially with witnesses. This may be even more important in enforcement or development certificate cases where evidence needs to be given on issues of fact. That's not a, it's a statement rather than a question, and it may be one on which Stuart and Assam have views as well. But do you have a comment or a view on that, Jerry, or is it less critical in?
I mean, I think there are all sorts of ways in which you could look at, should we do something virtually or physically? You could look at it on a cost-benefit analysis. If you're looking at a local an appeal hearing where an inspector has to travel halfway around the country to see a site, you might say, well, why would they sit at home and do a virtual event then? You know, why don't they do a real event in the location? If you're looking at pure cost-benefit analysis, local plans are not quite like that, are they? Because although inspectors visit, they don't have to be, you know, they might be there for several weeks, or they could go down. They can go down anytime really during their preparation, and a lot do go and see where they're examining. I think it's quite difficult to examine, you know, to think through what would be the criteria. Why would you do a hearing on whatever it is virtually, but then a hearing on a different topic the next day? For real, what is it that makes the difference? And I kind of understand all the stuff about not picking up on body language and the nuances in the room, but that feels quite intangible if you're going to try and come up with some kind of criteria to say, you know, if you're discussing housing needs, you need to pick up the body language in the room. But if you're talking about the viability of a site, that's not so important. So I think it's difficult because we've kind of made virtual work, haven't we, all of us? You know, we've kept the show on the road.
Yeah. All right. Well, as I think the question itself or the comment indicated, it may be an issue that arises more, not exclusively necessarily, but more in the context of enforcement or lawful development certificate cases. But yeah, thank you. Right. Well, time is pressing. So, and I know that that Peter has a number of anecdotes. So I'm going to pass over to Peter Rose. Thank you very much indeed, Jerry. Peter.
Thank you, Paul, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you to Paul and PEBA colleagues for the opportunity to speak with you all for a few minutes today. As Paul says, my name is Peter Rose. I am an inspector in the field, and with recent experience of conducting virtual 78 inquiries and accompanying case management conferences. In contrast to the high-level big picture themes which Rebecca and Jerry have just spoken of, I'm just going to say a few words drawing upon my general impressions of the front line in setting up and delivering virtual 78 inquiries. If you like, a flavour of some of the practical realities from the field. I have to say there's nothing new or sophisticated here in what I'm about to say. It amounts to just a reminder of a couple of obvious but still very important themes from which successful virtual inquiries can and do flow. But what I do hope to do is to try and tease out some aspects which may be helpful to you as advocates to bear in mind in discharging your own responsibilities, a few hints and reminders which may be useful to you over the coming period to think around. Now, I thought it would be helpful to draw out three particular themes as they relate to virtual inquiries. The first I've termed dialogue. The second I've called document management. And the third I'm referring to as delivery. It's coincidental, but the 3 Ds of the front line, if you like: dialogue, documents, and delivery. So turning to the first of those themes, dialogue, as we all know, Rosewell means there is now potential for direct inspector dialogue from the case management conference through to the inquiry closure, and indeed that is now to be expected. But the CMC, the case management conference, which has to take place within 7 weeks of the start date of the appeal, is where that dialogue should really start to take shape. and where you all as advocates need to be directly engaged. Frankly, it's the crucial foundation to virtual proceedings. And I'll say a little more on that in a moment. The CMC, in effect, should be the beginning of ongoing conversations around common cause. And that common cause is really about discharging a virtual inquiry as efficiently, as effectively, and as fairly as reasonably possible in the circumstances. That means identifying the specific actions at the CMC stage which are necessary for that to happen. And it means thinking about the technical IT challenges presented by a virtual inquiry format. And it also means recognising the responsibilities upon everyone involved to deliver their particular pieces of that wider virtual jigsaw. In short, the opportunity presented by the CMC cannot be understated, and do please take it. I see it very much as a springboard for everything else that then follows. At my events, there's tended to follow from the CMC a steady stream of subsequent questions, requests and suggestions from me through the case officer, all leading up to the virtual inquiry itself. And the reason for that is that I see the bigger picture with any virtual inquiry as being about us all hitting the ground running at 10 o'clock on that first morning, and so minimising the time pressures upon the virtual event itself. And for me, it means dealing with as much as we can procedurally in advance of the event itself. No surprises, nothing knowingly left unresolved to distract us from getting on with the business on that first morning. Now, if that sounds familiar, this is the sort of thinking I'm sure you recognise that also underscores the relevance of the Roswell Toolkit to the success of virtual events. Parties needing to be proactive, engaged, focused on outstanding areas of disagreement, and so on and so forth. All those same Roswell principles are now particularly key to the virtual format if it is going to succeed and be sustained. And in terms of dialogue, please don't forget the significance of other interested parties, whether enjoying Rule 6 status or not. And in that particular connection, I would commend the very helpful updated arrangements for PEBA pro bono support, and reflecting the recent efforts of Paul Tucker and Rebecca in taking that particular piece of work forward. But the wider point here is a virtual inquiry is not just a closed three-way informed discussion between the local planning authority, the appellant and the inspector. There are other interests to consider, and I will say more about that in the context of the virtual constraints in a moment. Moving on to the second theme, which, as I say, I've dubbed document management. And this is something which I very much see as the lifeblood of the event itself. And the underlying message I would give to everybody is don't underestimate the effort required, nor the potential returns to be yielded from that effort. There is a direct relationship between high quality document management and a successful event, is what I'm saying. Now, good document management won't in itself guarantee a successful and effective event, but without it, the prospects for it recede rapidly. At one level, in terms of document management, we have the obvious, the digital bundle, again to be identified through the CMC. And to date, the bundle has been generally supported through council websites. But do think about some of the key characteristics of that bundle and the documents within it. Is it timely? Is the information accurate? Is it up to date? Is the bundle comprehensive, and so on? But at another level, we also have the less obvious. And there are a number of less obvious things for teams, and in particular for you as their team leaders, which you might wish to think about. One possible elephant in the room is to ask just how fit for purpose is any particular website. However well-intended a host may be in their efforts to set up the website, the reality is that websites do and will vary in their technical capacity and quality. In technical terms, how reliable is the website, and are there issues? Some can be slow, some can be temperamental, and I'm sure we'll all be familiar with the occasional messages such as website not available, document not available, or awaiting website. Or the situation which can be particularly frustrating for you mid-examination, whereby for whatever reason a site just simply and silently freezes and without warning. So what I'm suggesting here is to ask the question, has the site been robustly tested pre-event, and is it fit for purpose? And leading on from that, will IT support be available if necessary from the host party during the event if there are issues? In terms of design, is the site well structured, and are documents easily accessed? Can members of the public follow it okay? And also, as we all know, events tend to evolve, information emerges. Can timely updates be made to websites throughout the event? And just going forward with the website, for you as advocates in your preparation, do consider presentations with reference to the website bundle references. I like to invite advocates to telegraph key CD references in advance of each session. And I think that's also linked to the wider points which Rebecca and Jerry have alluded to in terms of the benefits of a virtual event, in that I've certainly found that the virtual format does provide an easier and better facility for interested parties to follow. And I do think that's relevant as an understated benefit of a virtual inquiry. So if you are, for example, an interested third party for an inquiry, traditionally you have gone up to the town hall, you sat in the council chamber. If you're lucky, you might find a table with some documents on. Whereas now with a virtual event, if we're having an examination, say on living conditions relevant to local residents, I would ask the advocate to identify which particular CD references they'll be referring to in both their examination, cross-examination and re-examination. And I will try and accommodate an opportunity for those third parties to access the web, make sure they have documents available before them. And as I say, I do see that's very much an understated benefit of the virtual format. Finally, moving on to the third theme of delivery of the event itself. As with the pre-event matters, virtual event delivery requires the same continuing collaborative effort by all parties, again drawing upon the spirit and agreed actions of the CMC. Virtual inquiries does require forbearance and understanding, both of everyone and of circumstances as they arise. It's not just about websites or people's own IT arrangements. It's also about human factors. This is not an unusual and recurring pose of mine at virtual events, when people are speaking, but they've forgot to unmute their microphone. And just as frequently, I should say, an equally common pose of other people towards me, as I forget also. And just one very timely example, and I assure people this is not staged, and I know Paul came across it himself this afternoon, of some of the exigencies and left field events we have to try and accommodate at virtual inquiries. Just after lunch today, all inspectors received what's headed an important service announcement from our digital services team, and I'll just read it out directly, and you can draw your own conclusions. This email to all inspectors says that we have just been informed that there is an ongoing global issue with Microsoft Teams, whereby any user able to access Microsoft Teams may experience degraded performance with multiple features. This may cause problems for both Teams messaging and virtual events, whereby the end user may drop out of the event and will not be able to rejoin, or may not be able to join the event at all. The advice for virtual events that are currently in progress is for the event to be postponed for the remainder of today, and for it therefore to resume tomorrow or be rescheduled for an alternate date, time accordingly. As I say, I just mentioned that as an example of the sorts of things which may have to be accommodated within the overall management of virtual events. Just going on in terms of a couple of things, specific things around delivery, do consider pace, do allow for the fact that everyone following will want to try and absorb what's being said and to understand the arguments. And as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't always have to be rapid fire delivery, particularly if it's complex matters or there is a keen local interest, lay interest, which is following matters. And in that context, as I mentioned earlier, do think about the interests of other non-main parties. Remember, they will often be unfamiliar with planning, let alone with this new and unfamiliar world of virtual inquiries. And that applies whether they're to participate or just to observe. And I think it also has a bearing on your own position. As I understand it, as advocates, your purpose will be to win your case, but you'll not be seeking a Pyrrhic victory. By that, I'm guessing that the last thing you will want is a favourable decision based upon planning merits, but also a potentially unsound decision because of alleged treatment of opposing interested parties who may not consider they've had a fair hearing. And therefore, even though interested parties may be opposed to you, and even though you may succeed on the merits, there must still be an interest from all parties in ensuring they are able to express their position fairly, and that they have an appropriate hearing to do that through the inquiry process. In terms of delivery, I would also just add a couple of issues around what I would call general customer care and convenience as they relate to virtual inquiries. What I've noticed is that people can and will come and go throughout an inquiry in perhaps the way they don't and wouldn't if it was a physical event. For reasons best known to themselves and which I struggle to understand, one thing I've noticed is that I've seen a distinct drop-off in attendance at my events when we come to discuss 5-year housing land supply, and then a staggering rise in viewing figures when we get to closings. And I think the other thing that illustrates to me is the importance of closings. And I've certainly noticed a pick-up in participants at the closing stage of events, And that's also one of the reasons why I personally are very much in favour of closings being made virtually in person, if you like, or rather than in writing, because it is also the point at which everything comes together and interested third parties can absorb what the overall picture is, as well as the opportunity for me as the inspector to fully understand and appreciate the arguments being put forward and to ask any questions around that. So just bringing all that together in summary, what makes a successful 78 virtual event? Well, it is similar to what Jerry was saying in relation to local plans. Unfortunately, there is no silver bullet, but like most things, we only get out of something what we put in, and it is about everyone working together to make things happen, frankly. As with physical events, the success of the event itself will be significantly shaped by the collective preparation that precedes it, but also by the quality of technical facilities available to support it. And a sense I've picked up, it's almost a sense of irony in some sense, is that the sometimes less than perfect circumstances of virtual inquiries can actually help to galvanise the event and its atmosphere, in the sense that everyone's in the same boat, pulling together, and everyone needs to make that extra effort to ensure everything happens as it should. Well, then again, perhaps I've just been lucky in the events and the participants I've had at my events. The same features that contribute to successful physical events, respect and courtesy to the event and to everyone involved, everyone trying to be supportive in pursuit of that common cause, they are absolutely critical to the effective delivery of virtual inquiries. And finally, please do remember what the inspector is there for, albeit virtually, and what he or she is looking for from you as advocates at a virtual inquiry. He or she is not looking to have to referee some sort of virtual gladiatorial standoff between the parties, if you like. Ultimately, my purpose as an inquiry inspector is rather more simple and rather more basic. In a nutshell, I am seeking to ensure a fair hearing for everyone involved, whether directly participating or not, and to fully appreciate and understand the evidence being presented, and to try and do that as efficiently as possible. Well, that's the theory anyway. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Peter. Before I bring the others back in, I've got a couple of questions that I'm going to start by directing to you, because they do arise primarily in the context of appeals, but Rebecca and indeed Jerry may have views on them as well. Firstly, your second D, documents. I mean, you talked about the importance of electronic bundles, and I think anybody who's been through a virtual hearing, whether in court or at an inquiry, understands exactly what you're talking about. The question that came up was whether you've got any particular or special guidance, any tips about, and the way it was put was the preparation, the arrangement, or the presentation of electronic bundles. It seems to me there are possibly two separate parts to that. Firstly, the preparation and arrangement. You've talked about the hosting of it, but presentation for advocates and witnesses as well. I've just come out of an inquiry with townscape and heritage reasons for refusal, where almost every witness, both in chief and in cross-examination, extensive use was made of screen sharing. And I remember Rebecca's comments that had arisen about how, you know, sometimes people didn't make the most of that. Now, to make it work at this inquiry, it certainly when the advocates were cross-examining, both my opponent and I had a helpful assistant behind the scenes who had been given a list of the documents in advance and was calling them up and putting them on screen sharing as we needed them. And A, that worked quite well, and B, I think just in terms of public participation and the public being able to see whether it's the image or even the words of a policy that we're asking about, is something that you can achieve virtually, but you don't usually get at an ordinary in-person event. So I mean, I'd be interested to know what your thoughts are about presentation tips for that, screen sharing, whether it's a good or a bad thing, what makes it work, what arrangements are necessary to make it work, but also just when you're putting a set of core documents together, is there a way of arranging them that makes more sense or makes them more accessible to people? Have you got any views?
Yeah, I mean, can I just firstly answer that by saying that the views I've expressed, obviously my personal views to a degree, you'll find, different inspectors have a particular preference of doing the things in different ways. In terms of the formal position, if you look at the protocol that's on our website, there is some general guidance about structures of CD documents. But my overriding advice would be, just to go back to the point I made about dialogue and about the case management conference. I think if I was an advocate representing a party at an inquiry, that would be a question I would ask the inspector directly at the CMC. We've got a range of documents. What form, what structure, what composition of documents are you looking for us to do? Now, the approach I've found helpful in constructing the website is, I think there's always a danger that it simply becomes another folder on the council's planning website, and people have to negotiate, find their way in and so on. It's just added in that way. I've tended to ask for a four-part structure, whereby part one would be what I would call the inquiry background documents, which would be things like my case management conference note, my subsequent suggestions and correspondence around that. I would then have a second part, which would be the core documents, all clearly labelled up. And the third part would then be the proofs. And then the fourth element, and this tends to be the trickiest as events evolve, is what I would call the inquiry documents, the new stuff that comes through. But I wouldn't take a view on that as a party until after I've raised it with the inspector at the case management conference. And I've had case management conferences, for example, where we had an issue around character and appearance, and an advocate said that they wanted to consider PowerPoint presentations, and I was happy to entertain that because, well, firstly, it seemed sensible, but secondly, it is the advocate's case to present as they feel best, as they feel most appropriate, and therefore combining documents and dialogue, for me, all roads point back to that CMC. Have that discussion at that point, and hopefully you'll get some clear guidance and clear advice specific to that case 7 weeks after the start date, early in proceedings, and everybody knows where they stand.
Rebecca, I see your camera's on. Did you want to come in on this?
Yes, thank you, Paul. Absolutely, Peter is right. Each inspector will, have different requirements, but I think universally, a document that is easily accessible, so you can easily find your way around the document. All parties can do that with tabulation and clearly marked where different parts of the evidence are. I think universally that's something all inspectors do appreciate, particularly for a virtual setting.
Yeah,
thank you.
I think also, Paul, one of the things which I find really frustrating is where an inspector is being presented with reams of irrelevant history. You know, I mean, particularly, for example, when you go into the plans folder and you find 6 or 7 revisions and modifications which have no relevance at all, and you can't spot, you know, version 7G. You can find 7F and you can find 7B. It's that sort of thing. So I think there's almost a case for saying, look, let's have some document housekeeping, you know, some spring cleaning before you even think about the CDs. And let's be clear about what you're doing, because the inquiry, the 78 inquiry, is not about rerunning history. You know, the 78 inquiry is about deciding the same proposal within the context of circumstances as they currently apply. You know, and unless you're talking about costs and so on and so forth, which is a different debate, a lot of that history is probably not relevant.
Thank you. I said I had 2 particular issues, Peter, and the second is one which probably, in my capacity as PEBA chair, and I get more emails about than anything else, and this is sort of sitting hours. I think most of us, not everybody, but most of us have found that the experience of doing what we do, even an ordinary inquiry, is quite intensive, but that if you're sitting in front of a screen doing it as well, it is particularly draining. And I know we've, in various conversations we've had with PINs about this over the last year, almost everybody we speak to has said, yes, that's right. And there's been, if not sort of general agreement, that the way forward is whether, you know, something like 3 1.5-hour sessions a day, but that, you know, that some sort of structure of that sort was appropriate, but also a recognition that long sitting days are just difficult. But the messages that come back to me repeatedly from PEBA members is that there doesn't seem to be any consistency among the inspectorate as to how this happens. I mean, the inquiry that I've just finished this week was an inspector who was very, very clearly of the view, 3 1.5-hour sessions, that's it. And everybody, both advocates, agreed that that was a sensible way forward, and actually that you don't lose time by putting that sort of constraint on it, because you know, people are properly focused and engaged while it's happening. But equally, this week I've had members talking about, and I shan't name names at all, but you know, other of your colleagues who are sitting from 9 till 5 with a 10-minute break in the morning and a half an hour for lunch. I mean, I have my own view about that, quite a strong one. But you know, is there any sort of consistency? Is it just left to the inspector to decide? Is there a message that comes down from on high? And if not, could there be a message that comes down from on high?
I'll let Rebecca clarify the official position, but if I just say what I do, and then we can work back from there. Again, I'm beginning to sound like a stuck record, but it does go back to the case management conference. Basically, what I say at the case management conference is I take the company line and I say the expectation is that there will be 3 sessions, each session something of the order of 1.5 hours to 2 hours maximum. I say that we'll start at 10 o'clock on the first day, but we will start at 9:30 on the subsequent days. And as a general rule, what I go for is 2 sessions in the morning, 9:30 say to 11, half-hour break, then a second morning session up to lunch, then a decent lunch break, and then a third session in the afternoon. But one general point I make to advocates at the CMC, in which I repeat at the event itself, is that I am looking to be guided by the advocates in terms of when we adjourn, when we break. I'm sure there's nothing more frustrating than you being in mid-flow with a witness and you've got 10 minutes to complete, and I say, no, I'm sorry, Mr. Brown, we said 11 o'clock, we're now adjourning. And I'm looking not only for you to guide me, but for you to collaborate with the other advocates and come up with something sensible. And personally, and this is, again, this is a personal view, But if you were to say to me, you know, I know we've been sitting for 4.5 hours today, but I think we can close this off today if we had an extra half hour at the end of it of today or whatever, and everybody was happy with that, I would look favourably upon that. That would be my view. But as I say, the line we're being asked to apply, which I think is perfectly feasible and perfectly correct, is the 3 sessions, each of an hour and a half. And what I would say is, again, just personal reflections. My first virtual inquiry, I think, ran for about 4 or 5 days, and I can remember feeling absolutely shattered at the end of it. And they were only 4.5 hour, only 4.5 hour days that we were doing. So I mean, there is a real issue here, and I think the other thing which does bother me is, you know, you and your colleagues are making very important points you want the inspector to absorb, and I think it does become disrespectful and difficult to do that once you start to tire, and I think that's another reason why, you know, some sort of cap on that is important. Rebecca,
Jerry, have you thoughts about that at all?
These things usually tend to arrive with me if they're a problem. So I haven't had a groundswell of people, you know, noise hitting me that this has been a problem in local plan examination. So maybe they've all been running really well virtually, or maybe not. The one, I mean, it's always difficult in the planning inspector to know how directive to be with inspectors. I mean, the general philosophy has been they're the ones that are appointed to examine the plan or the appeal, and we give them a fair amount of freedom to do so. The general advice we give local plan examiners is it's much better to finish a session early, and no one will be really cross at you for doing that, than to have sessions run late. It's often very difficult to work out exactly how long a local plan session will last. And some will inevitably overrun a little bit, but you know, the aim has got to be to try, you know, better to finish early than to you know, have really long sessions.
Rebecca.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd echo what Peter and Jerry have said, really. Absolutely. If it's an inconvenient point to break just because you've been sitting for an hour and a half, absolutely guided by the advocates in that situation. But, you know, our clear guidance is quite strong that they, you know, certainly shouldn't be sitting for more than that, and not long days, because of the duty of care to all parties, and, you know, considerations around their, you know, home caring, you know, other responsibilities as well. And, you know, it does eat into that. So we've been really, really firm about that. And I'm sort of disappointed to hear that there are still inspectors there running into the long, you know, into long hours and further than, you know, the 3 hours that we recommend.
Good. Well,
I think also, as you said to what Rebecca said, I mean, it also goes back to this issue of interested third parties. You know, we must bear in mind the fact that people may not be available to observe proceedings when they wish to observe proceedings, and therefore going on late in the afternoon when they've got competing domestic responsibilities, you know, could well be a problem for them, and that's something that we as inspectors have to think about.
Stuart, Ahsan, you've been waiting silently in the wings observing. Is there anything that you wanted to say on any of these issues? Or Stuart, do you want to get in a quick word for your blockbuster enforcement sessions?
Yes, the trailer for the blockbuster, yes. I think, I mean, the points everybody's raised about times are absolutely right. And I think also Rebecca's point concerns me a lot. And I've made a note we must do something about it, which is getting inspectors sitting for too long. Particularly at present, where you do lose concentration. We know in meetings, Zoom meetings, Teams meetings, whatever else, any event, you just can't actually focus on it because you have nowhere to rest your eyes. You're staring at the screen the whole time. It actually becomes quite tense. And, you know, it's very important to think about the well-being of people and breaks and so on. So yes, I absolutely agree with that. I don't know.
I'm really pleased to hear that. I know it's a message that you know, most members of PEBA would echo and reinforce. Hassan, did you have anything you wanted to come in on?
Just on the point, David Elvin QC made a point about lawful development certificates and enforcement appeals. Yeah, we can pick this up when we do the enforcement blockbuster, I hope. But yeah, that was something we took into account, and grateful for PEBA to help us in developing oaths and evidence on oath and affirmation guidance for inspectors, which has worked so far, but more later when we do the.
Well, we were very pleased to be asked, and we've been delighted to be of assistance there, Hassan. It's part of a long-standing. It's part of you coming and talking to us. It's been a two-way process, and one that I genuinely believe and hope has been mutually beneficial. So, but thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we're coming up to 6:30, which is already a little longer than I'd expected to be this evening. I think I've asked most of the questions that came up on the Q&A as they've come along. If I haven't got to yours, I'm really sorry, but we do have to draw an end to this at some stage. And I know people have, we've just been talking about them, other commitments to attend to. Ordinarily, I'd ask for a round of applause, but you're all muted, so nobody would hear it. So on your behalf, I'm simply going to say thank you very much to everybody this evening. It's been really, really useful, very interesting. There's stuff there that we will take away. There's a dialogue which I know will continue, particularly, Rebecca, with you as part of your consultation process on the way forward. And we really look forward to engaging with that. So with that said, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you found it useful. And thank you again to our guests. Safe journey to those who need to travel. Good night.
Thanks. Bye.